May 1942. Deep inside the operations room of the battleship Yamato, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke, heated metal, and the faint vibration of generators hidden behind armored bulkheads. The long table map of the Pacific stretched beneath harsh electric lamps, its blue surface covered in neat grid lines and lacquered wooden blocks shaped like carriers, cruisers, and air groups. Around it stood the senior admirals of the Imperial Navy, their white gloves resting on the railing that encircled the map, their breath forming a low, continuous murmur that blended with the relentless ticking of a brass clock mounted above the doorway. Every movement in the room carried a grave, ceremonial precision. Pointers tapped softly as Japanese formations were pushed forward across the ocean with steady confidence, their shadows sliding over the map like dark brushstrokes. Each dice roll struck the table with a sharp, echoing clatter, but the outcomes, strangely consistent, always tilted in favor of the Empire. Strike groups that should have suffered losses instead returned whole. American reconnaissance flights that ought to have revealed approaching danger somehow failed to detect anything. The results, recorded by quiet umpires with impeccable politeness, shaped a picture of the coming battle that felt almost too clean. When a simulated American counterattack managed to score a critical hit on a Japanese carrier, the reaction in the room was immediate and subtle. A brief exchange of glances, a quiet clarification, a wooden block that had been set aside in the sunk tray returned to the board without protest, restored as if the ocean itself had granted mercy. The rules of the game shifted with the needs of the plan. Uncomfortable possibilities were smoothed away. Each correction made the Japanese advance shine a little brighter, a little more flawless, until the scenario resembled not a rehearsal of war, but a portrait of inevitable triumph. The atmosphere thickened as the hours passed. Papers rustled, shoes scraped softly on the steel deck. Sweat gathered beneath uniform collars as the admirals leaned over the map, their silhouettes merging across the room like a single dark mass of authority and conviction. The war game advanced, methodical and orderly, untouched by the chaos that defined real combat. Sunken ships reappeared. American forces were denied unpredicted maneuvers. Every complication dissolved with an effortless stroke, leaving behind a vision of absolute control. By the end of the fourth day, the map showed a perfect victory. Midway captured, American carriers destroyed, and the Imperial Navy steaming onward, unstoppable. It was a result that pleased everyone in the room, a proof that the plan was not only sound, but destined to succeed. Yet in the forced neatness of the map, and in the silence that followed the final roll of the dice, the disaster to come was already taking shape. The errors hidden here, beneath the glow of the lamps and the steady hands of confident men, would not remain buried. When the great warship later turned toward the open sea, the battle it imagined would no longer align with the one waiting beyond the horizon, and the first cracks in Japan's destiny had already opened, in this quiet room, under the weight of 4 days of carefully constructed lies. By the beginning of May 1942, the Imperial Navy moved across the Pacific with the confidence of a force that believed itself chosen by destiny. Every corridor of every flagship carried the same quiet certainty, the same restrained pride forged through 6 months of unbroken victories. Pearl Harbor had fallen silent under the hammer of the First Air Fleet. Malaya and Singapore had collapsed with a speed that stunned the world. Java, Rabaul, the Philippines, all had bent, one after another, before the momentum of the empire. The ocean itself seemed to open before Japanese steel, as though acknowledging the Navy's right to shape the fate of the Pacific. This aura of triumph seeped into planning rooms, ward rooms, and every staff office from Tokyo to Truk. Maps were unfurled with an ease bordering on complacency.
Orders were drafted with the calm assurance of a force that had come to equate its rapid victories with permanent superiority. The rhythm of the fleet changed. Drills felt smoother, reports more optimistic, briefings shorter and more confident. Officers spoke of timing not in terms of risk, but in terms of opportunity. Conversations that had once carried the urgency of survival now drifted toward expansion, consolidation, and the inevitable weakening of American resolve. Across the naval hierarchy, the phrase "shori byo," victory sickness, never appeared in official documents, yet its presence shaped decisions with invisible weight. The High Command increasingly viewed American forces as slow to react, hesitant, predictable. The idea that the United States might re-enter the fight with renewed strength no longer resonated. Even the damage suffered at Coral Sea, the first real check against the Empire's momentum, was explained away as a momentary setback rather than a warning. Inside Tokyo's naval headquarters, walls lined with detailed maps of the Pacific reflected the bloom of this dangerous certainty. Staff officers moved markers with the same confident precision seen aboard Yamato during the Midway simulations, their hands tracing routes toward islands still untouched by war. Every arrow seemed to point forward. Every projection assumed that the enemy lagged behind. American industry, American carriers, American pilots, all were believed to be months away from regaining true strength. As May progressed, the plan against Midway took shape not as a necessity, but as a natural continuation of triumph. The idea that the Americans might anticipate the strike, or that damaged carriers like Yorktown could return to battle readiness in days instead of months, barely entered the calculations. Intelligence uncertainties were minimized. Opposing capabilities were smoothed over. The Empire, drifting deeper into its own belief in inevitability, saw Midway not as a contested battlefield, but as a prize already leaning toward Japanese hands. On the decks of carriers, on the bridges of cruisers, and in the quiet lounges where officers shared nighttime tea, the same quiet conviction grew. The war had entered a phase where Japan merely needed to reach out and take what remained of the Pacific. The possibility of surprise or catastrophe receded from thought. Victory had become expected. Victory had become assumed. Victory had become a lens that distorted the horizon. And as the fleet prepared to move east, the shadow of overconfidence stretched invisibly over every steel hull. A shadow that would not be recognized until it began to fracture in the firelit morning sky above Midway.
In the weeks leading up to the Midway operation, the corridors of Japanese command moved with a rehearsed precision, but beneath that discipline lay a brittle silence. The staff rooms of the combined fleet, usually alive with debate, now carried an unusual calm, the sort that forms not from agreement, but from the quiet suppression of doubt. Officers gathered around tables marked with neat arcs representing predicted American movements, yet every line traced upon the maps seemed guided more by expectation than caution. When junior officers attempted to express concern, their voices entered the room lightly and disappeared just as lightly. Questions about fuel reserves, the strain on carrier air crews after months of continuous operations, or the uncertain intelligence regarding American carrier positions received polite nods, but no real engagement. The structure of hierarchy, once a framework for coordinated decision-making, hardened into something rigid. No one wished to be the voice that interrupted the momentum of a plan already being treated as destiny. During the final rehearsals, the war games that took place aboard Yamato revealed this quiet pressure in stark, unmistakable ways. A simulated torpedo strike that should have crippled a Japanese carrier was brushed aside. A mistake in timing that led to a hypothetical American counterattack was corrected not by adjusting tactics,
but by adjusting reality inside the simulation. When umpires hesitated, the senior officer's expectations filled the pause, guiding outcomes without a word being spoken. A pattern emerged. Whenever the American side behaved unpredictably, the umpires were gently reminded that such actions were unlikely. If American planes struck earlier than expected, the scenario was restarted. If American forces maneuvered aggressively, their actions were marked as unrealistic. The simulation, originally designed to expose hidden risks, now served to conceal them. Over 4 tense days, every outcome was sculpted until it resembled the victory Japanese planners wanted, not the battle they would face. This atmosphere permeated every level of command. In intelligence offices, reports mentioning unusual American radio silence or increased activity around Pearl Harbor were filed without urgency. At briefings aboard the carriers, air group leaders discussed flight plans that assumed Midway's defenses would crumble under the first morning strike, just as the simulation foretold. The planners did not question why the Americans might react differently. They assumed every piece would fall neatly into place. Even among enlisted sailors preparing aircraft in humid hangar bays, rumors spread that the Americans were too weakened from earlier defeats to respond effectively. The courage of the Empire's pilots had become legend, the Empire's vulnerability unthinkable. The silence that smothered dissent in Tokyo extended across the fleet, turning uncertainty into something shameful, something to be hidden behind polite smiles and perfect salutes. By the time the last staff meeting concluded and the ships began to move east, the opportunity for correction had vanished. Reports remained unread, contradictions unresolved, risk unspoken. The fleet advanced behind a wall of its own making, forged from confidence, polished into dogma. What the simulations had erased, reality would soon restore with merciless clarity. And within that silence, thick, heavy, unbroken, the fate of 4 carriers had already been sealed, long before a single American aircraft appeared over the horizon.
By late May 1942, while the Japanese fleet gathered strength and moved with serene confidence toward Midway, events thousands of kilometers away had already broken the backbone of their plan. Inside a set of windowless rooms on Oahu, under humming fluorescent lights and the constant clatter of typewriters, American codebreakers pieced together fragments of radiograms transmitted by the Imperial Navy. What emerged from those scattered numbers and intercepted ciphers was not speculation, but certainty. The next Japanese objective was AF, the codename long suspected to mean Midway. Once the confirmation came, after a simple ruse in which Midway broadcast a fake report of a water shortage and Japan dutifully repeated it within encrypted traffic, the American response unfolded with silent speed. Aircraft carriers that Japanese planners believed still damaged or retreating from combat were suddenly set in motion. Repair crews swarmed over the crippled Yorktown at Pearl Harbor, working night and day beneath floodlights that threw harsh shadows across the punctured deck. Riveters hammered, welders cut steel, and cranes swung overhead as if the ship were being pulled back to life by sheer will. 3 days after limping into harbor, Yorktown sailed again, bearing scars beneath a fresh coat of paint. Across the Pacific, patrol aircraft widened their search arcs, skimming low over restless ocean swells, their engines humming against the wind as crews scanned for any sign of the approaching enemy. Submarines slipped quietly into new patrol lines. Communications officers updated bearings. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the resurrected Yorktown, moved into position northeast of Midway, hidden by the vastness of the ocean and shielded by strict radio silence. Every key assumption built into the Japanese operation had already collapsed, though the fleet steaming eastward had no knowledge of it. The prized element of surprise, central to the Midway plan, was gone. The carefully coordinated timing, the idea that the Americans would respond slowly and predictably, no longer matched reality.
The distances that Japanese planners believed would keep American carriers too far from the battle dissolved the moment the Americans sailed early, guided by decrypted intelligence rather than by Japanese expectations. On Midway itself, runways were patched, fuel stores camouflaged, and aircraft were dispersed around the atoll. Crews prepared torpedoes and bombs beneath the glare of the tropical sun. Marine pilots studied maps of probable attack routes, while B-17s lined the airfield in long rows, their engines coughing to life in the damp morning heat. Anti-aircraft batteries were dug deeper into sandbags, their barrels angled upward toward the sky that would soon be filled with enemy aircraft. Day by day, Japanese forces advanced into a trap they had unknowingly triggered. Their reconnaissance routes were too narrow, shaped by the same assumptions that had distorted the war games aboard Yamato. Their search planes, launched in strict patterns, skimmed over empty portions of the ocean while American carriers waited just beyond the edge of their sweeps. A single reconnaissance aircraft, delayed by minor technical issues, failed to cover the full arc required, a gap that would soon prove fatal. Still, the fleet pressed on, engines thundering beneath rising columns of exhaust that drifted across the water. The ocean swell carried the carriers forward, their decks busy with final preparations, munitions stacked in tidy rows, fuel crews checking lines, aircraft positioned for the first strike. Everything unfolded exactly as the plan dictated, exactly as the simulations had promised. Confidence radiated across the task force like heat from the sun. The idea that the enemy might already be waiting was as distant as the American coastline itself. But the Pacific had already shifted. The Americans knew where the blow would fall, and they had taken position with the patience of hunters. As the Japanese fleet approached the point of no return, the skies above Midway hardened into a silent arena, vast and empty, ready for the battle, already decided not by admirals nor strategy, but by the cracks hidden in a plan that had never been allowed to face the truth. And, ahead, just beyond Japan's vision, the trap continued to tighten, a quiet, invisible noose that would soon snap shut with the force of history.
The first light of June 4, 1942, revealed a sky washed pale by the rising sun and a sea that rolled gently beneath the hulls of the Japanese carriers. Lieutenant Commander Takao Ishikawa, serving on the flagship Akagi, moved across the narrow passage outside the flight deck control room, feeling the vibration of engines thrumming through the steel beneath his boots. Dawn operations had begun in flawless order. Aircraft warmed on deck, armorers loaded 60-kilogram bombs for the first strike on Midway, and flight crews adjusted goggles under the sharp, salty wind. Everything appeared to match the timing of the war games perfectly, as though the day were unfolding from a script rehearsed weeks earlier. Yet even in the disciplined rhythm of the morning, Ishikawa sensed a tension in the air, a stiffness in the voices of the officers gathering around the charts. The first strike group had departed, their engines leaving a long ribbon of sound across the sky, but the calm did not last long. Reports from Midway arrived intermittently, fragmented, uncertain. The island was damaged but far from neutralized. Anti-aircraft fire remained intense. Pilots called back with requests for new strikes, and these scattered words collided with another complication. American aircraft were already probing the fleet. Ishikawa watched as Admiral Nagumo faced the dilemma the simulations had concealed. Aircraft needed to be relaunched against Midway to finish the job. Yet the possibility of American carriers nearby, still unconfirmed, still only a threat on paper, pressed just as urgently. In the narrow Combat Information Center, sweat collected beneath uniform collars as officers leaned over maps lit by dim lamps. Voices rose, not in panic, but in hurried recalculation. The plan demanded that the aircraft be rearmed with land attack bombs. The instinct of the fleet demanded readiness for a carrier duel. Below deck, armorers and flight crews began the dangerous work of changing ordnance.
Ishikawa descended into the hangar for a brief inspection, and the scene stretched around him like a labyrinth of danger. Bomb carts rattled across the floor. Teams of mechanics swarmed over Zero fighters. Fuel hoses snaked from open tanks, and torpedoes gleamed under harsh lights. Stacks of explosives stood in careful rows along the bulkheads. Every open fuel line, every unsecured crate, every dripping hose transformed the hangar into a vast powder magazine awaiting a single spark. Above them, the search plane from Tone, delayed earlier by mechanical trouble, finally sent its long-awaited message: enemy ships present. The words cracked through the command room like a blade striking stone. Ishikawa felt the shift in the atmosphere as Nagumo's staff froze between two impossible choices. The aircraft on deck were armed for Midway, not for enemy carriers. The aircraft returning from the first strike were low on fuel and needed recovery. The American formation remained uncertain, perhaps a single cruiser, perhaps the vanguard of a carrier group. Minutes bled away. Orders changed, then changed again. Ishikawa could sense the mounting pressure in the Admirals' decisions, shaped not only by the battle unfolding, but by the war games that had promised time would always favor the Japanese. That promise no longer held. The deck crew struggled to realign aircraft, shifting them forward and back with practiced efficiency, but the cramped carrier decks could not erase the minutes lost. Each new report from scouting aircraft tightened the snare forming around the fleet. The carriers continued turning into the wind, their wakes stretching behind them in long white scars across the Pacific, but the Japanese formation now bore the invisible weight of its own delay. Ishikawa returned topside, the sunlight glaring against the metal around him, and he scanned the sky that stretched empty in every direction. No American aircraft were visible. The horizon shimmered peacefully. Yet in that deceptive calm, he sensed how exposed the fleet had become. Decks crowded with armed, fueled planes, hangars packed tight with munitions, and every second drawing the formation farther into danger. Then faint and distant voices crackled across the radio network. Scattered sightings, uncertain headings, incomplete warnings, each one marking the approach of something closing in with relentless speed. Ishikawa tightened his grip on the railing as the heat of the sun bore down on the deck. The moment that had been dismissed as unlikely during the war games was now materializing in the sky. And somewhere beyond the horizon, American dive bombers were already beginning their final descent toward the unsuspecting carriers.
The morning of June 4, 1942, reached its breaking point with the deceptive calm that often precedes disaster. The ocean stretching in every direction like a polished blade, glinting under a merciless sun, and aboard the carriers of the First Air Fleet, the tension condensed into something almost physical, a weight pressing down on every man moving across the heated decks. Lieutenant Commander Takao Ishikawa stood near the island structure of Akagi, watching deck crews rush to correct the sequence of aircraft that had been reshuffled twice in less than an hour, their movements frantic yet disciplined, the metallic echo of wheels, chains, and shouted orders merging into a single chaotic rhythm that revealed the extent to which the fleet had already lost control of its timing. Fuel hoses lay sprawled across the deck, torpedoes waited half-secured beside piles of land attack bombs, and aircraft with their cowlings open dripped fuel and oil onto wooden planks that had absorbed years of similar stains, but never so many at once. The carriers were no longer weapons. They had become slow-moving reservoirs of explosives, each second tightening the trap invisible in the sky above. At 10:20 a.m., the first shadow crossed the formation. It was small at first, a distant shape high above the fleet, unnoticed by most of the crew, but Ishikawa saw it, and a faint unease crept into him as he recognized the angular silhouette forced into a near-vertical descent. One aircraft became three,
then 5, then more, appearing like fragments of a broken star, the sunlight catching the wings of the American SBD Dauntless dive bombers as they rolled into their attack. No warning call had reached Akagi's bridge. No scout plane had detected the enemy formation early enough, and the Japanese fighters were far below the bombers, chasing the remnants of torpedo squadrons that had already spent themselves in suicidal waves against the carrier group. The sky above the fleet, which Japanese planners believed they controlled, had become the entry point for the blow their simulations had claimed impossible. The dive bombers pierced the air with a shriek that cut through engines, orders, and fear alike. Ishikawa watched as the lead American aircraft released its bomb, a dark, compact shape that fell toward the deck in absolute silence before erupting into a detonation that tore open the forward flight deck. Flames leapt upward with terrifying speed, igniting fuel lines, blasting aircraft into fragments that rained down in burning arcs. A second bomb struck moments later, exploding near the island structure, sending a blast wave through the command center and throwing officers to the floor. The third bomb pierced deep into the hangar deck, where rows of fueled and armed aircraft waited in suffocating heat. The ensuing explosion erupted through vents and hatches like a volcanic surge. The Akagi shuddered as if the sea itself had struck her. To starboard, Kaga was already engulfed in towering pillars of flame, 3 direct hits having transformed her into a furnace that roared across the water. Aircraft detonated in chain reactions, their munitions cooking off in rapid succession, sending shards of metal spinning outward like shrapnel ripped from the ship's own frame. Men who moments earlier had been rushing to prepare the second strike were now running blindly through walls of smoke, their silhouettes flickering like ghosts against orange firelight. Further off, Sori twisted beneath massive explosions that lifted sections of her deck before dropping them into the flames below. The carriers did not sink yet. They burned, their deaths slow and agonizing, the heat visible even from hundreds of meters away. Ishikawa staggered across the debris-littered deck, the smell of burning fuel mixing with the sharp tang of scorched metal and the sickening sweetness of burning paint. He saw officers trying to coordinate damage control, their voices drowned by secondary explosions erupting from the hangar below. He saw a pilot crawling toward the edge of the deck, his flight suit smoldering as he tried to stand. He saw sailors attempting to push munitions overboard only to be consumed by fire before reaching the rail. The carrier that once symbolized Japanese naval supremacy had become a battlefield of flames, every compartment a death trap. In the span of 5 minutes, the First Air Fleet, the core of Japan's naval air power, the pride of the empire, the force that had carried victories across the Pacific, was shattered beyond recovery. 3 carriers lay fatally wounded, their flight decks destroyed, their hangars infernos, their crews fighting a hopeless battle against fire that grew louder and stronger with every passing heartbeat. Hours later, the 4th carrier, Hiruyu, struck back briefly, launching 2 counterattacks that damaged Yorktown. But even she could not escape the net closing around her. American dive bombers found her by late afternoon, delivering the same merciless judgment. Flames rose from her flight deck, black smoke climbing into the sky like a final signal of Japan's undone ambitions. By sunset, the Empire had lost 4 carriers and the better part of its frontline air crews, an entire naval generation erased in a single day. As evening fell, the Pacific quieted again, but it was no longer the same ocean that had greeted the fleet that morning. The burning hulks drifted like wounded animals, their steel warped, their decks collapsed, their crews evacuated or perishing in the flames. Ishikawa, pulled from Akagi before she was scuttled, watched the fires consume the carrier from the deck of a rescue destroyer, the orange glow reflecting in his eyes as if he were watching the death of something larger than a ship. He understood, as many did in that hour, that Japan's naval supremacy had ended not in gradual decline, not through attrition, but in a single devastating moment forged by the false certainty born weeks earlier on the Yamato, where rigged war games had promised victory the Empire's strategy could not deliver. And as the last flames flickered against the night horizon, it became clear to every surviving officer that the catastrophe of Midway had not begun in battle, but in a quiet room filled with maps and wooden blocks, where truth had been dismissed in favor of confidence, and where the course of an empire had already been sealed long before the bombs ever fell from the sky.